Language. So for this class, we're going to be focusing on language. And first of all, let's define language. So for this class, we're going to define language as a system of symbolic communication using sounds and/or gestures that are able to be understood by all members within that society that share that language. And when we're talking about language, we're really looking at how people communicate, so the primary means of communication. And with communication, we're talking about speech, so the spoken or enacted if you're talking about sign language, the words that we say. The second one is writing, so the words that we read and write. And then body language, so that's the gestures that we use, to the way if maybe our bodies lean in when we're talking or lean out, or the space between each other when we're communicating with each other. All three of those, speech, writing, and body, incorporate language, and all of them are situated in a very much into a cultural understanding. They're culturally located. And what I mean that, language is culturally located is that it's transmitted through learning, and it's transmitted through learning in your social environment. A child, a baby, when it's born, doesn't automatically start speaking its native language, right? It learned its language through communicating with its parents, through other people around them, through even TV, and then later on the books that they read and all of that. Language is built upon learning from other persons in your community. Another thing about language is that it's based on learned associations between words and all the things they stand for. So in the right hand side I have a picture of a tree, and then down below it I have three words for tree that in three different languages. So English tree, French arbre, and Finnish puu. Now all three represent the same thing, right? A tree. But they are also very different. And that's really interesting about the diversity of language, that for one sort of item, such as a tree, there can be many ways to describe it depending on the culture and the society that is describing that item. And with all that diversity then, anthropologists who study language, they want to study it not only about the diversity of language, but they want to study about how language is situated in a social and cultural context. Human culture is ultimately dependent upon an elaborate system of communication. That's what makes humans very unique, is our communication. And that it's also far more complex than that of any other species. So our language, it really makes us unique in the animal world. And language evolutionarily, language offered a tremendous advantage to humans. Language permits the information stored by a human society to exceed far beyond that of any non-human group. It offered a way for individuals to not only communicate effectively with one another, but to store knowledge, to obtain knowledge, to also, as well as to sort of create a vehicle for learning and to grow, and for growth. So let's get on to then linguistic anthropology. And linguistic anthropology, as you'll see in the slides later on, can be also called other terms. But for the first part, let's just talk about linguistic anthropology. And linguistic anthropologists study how language influences social life. And it looks at how language shapes communication, forms social identity groups, as well as your own personal identity, organizes large-scale cultural beliefs, develops cultural representation of natural and social worlds. So it's really looking at language and culture. But also what linguistic anthropology does it does take from linguistics, which is the scientific study of language. And linguistics look at language form and the meaning and the context behind language. And they look at it through these four ways. One is phonology, and that's the sound study. The study of language sounds. So, for example, the differences of how different languages use vowels, as well as I always think about the rolling R, that's really prominent in Italian and Spanish, but not really evident in English or other languages. And then the next thing is morphology, and that's looking at the form study. So that's looking at the study of the patterns or rules of word formation in a language. So verb tenses, so like ran, run, running, pluralization, and then compound words. The next thing is to look at syntax. And syntax are the patterns or rules by which words are arranged into phrases and sentences. So I've been very fortunate enough to live in countries where English is not the first language. And in order to get by, I had to learn, basic language skills. So when I was living in Hungary, I had to learn basic Hungarian, which, if anybody studies Hungarian, it's a very difficult language to learn and master. But a great example for me about syntax is that if I said in English, if I say in English, I speak Hungarian, you have that sort of ways of where the words are arranged in a really particular order. But if I said that same phrase, I speak Hungarian, in Hungarian, which is beszélek, it literally translated, the syntax would be speak I Hungarian. So they switch their verbs and their nouns, and they switch the sort of the syntax of the language around. What's fun about Hungarian, and something that a lot of people notice about it, is that you kind of start speaking in like as Yoda, because you kind of go speak I Hungarian, run I down the street. Like it's a really fun language to learn. But that's just a quick example of syntax. And of course, probably most of us are very familiar with grammar through grade school and above, and that looks at the entire formal structure of a language, including morphology and syntax, as well as a bit of phonology. Language, thought, and culture. So another way that we can think about linguistic anthropology is through the word of ethnolinguistics, which is the study of relationship between language and culture and how they mutually influence and inform each other. And with ethnolinguistics, we're talking a lot about linguistic relativity, and that's the idea that the distinctions encoded in one language are unique to that language, meaning that we should look at how the differences within that language also reflect the cultural differences in the community that's speaking that language. Now, a very sort of profound thinker, prominent thinker in linguistic and especially ethnolinguistics is Noam Chomsky. And he's contributed a lot in the way that we think about language today. But one of the arguments that he brought forward is that he argues that all languages have a common structural basis, meaning that all languages share common roots and common ways of thinking. And really, Chomsky's very interested in the universals between language, that despite all the differences, and there are, incredibly huge differences between languages, there is a common structural sort of logic and basis behind it. And that, looking at that, then we can understand much broader ideas about human society in general. On the flip side of Chomsky is Edward Sapir and Benjamin Lee Whorf, and they argue that the grammatical categories of a particular language lead their speakers to think about things in a different way. So they're really focusing on the particularities of that language and how those particularities influence that community's beliefs and the way that they think and the way they sort of even structure their lives. So an example that is also, I think, brought into your book is that in English we have a really sort of strong division between past, present, and future. So, for example, I ran yesterday, I am running right now, or I will run tomorrow, right? So you have past, present, and future. And that sort of syntax is really important, right? It really sort of situates you in this sort of time frame. But that time frame of past, present, and future is not shared by all communities in all languages. For example, the Hopi Indians in the United States, they don't have this sort of division in their language of past, present, and future. Instead, they talk in their language events that have existed and then events that have not existed. So it's not that events that are in the past or events in the present or in the future, but instead they're talking about it in the way of that if it existed or if it had not existed. And then that's really interesting to understand then how does this language structure then influence or is influenced by Hopi cultural beliefs, the geography that they're living in, as well as how they structure themselves socially. Another thing about language, thought, and culture is to look at the focal vocabulary, and that's a specialized set of terms and distinctions that are particularly important to certain groups. So an example is that the Aymara Indians that are located in the Bolivian highlands, they have over 200 words for potato. And another example is the Nuer pastoralists of Africa have over 400 names for cattle. Now, if you understand these two communities and how they're situated, such as the Aymara Indians, potato is and the varieties of potato that there are a major food source for them. So yeah, if potato is a very important factor in your community, you could easily then have 200 words for that. Whereas for the Nuer pastoralists of Africa, their livelihood depends on cattle. Having all these different distinctions and words for cattle makes sense if that's really, you structure your life as a pastoralist. Another factor is that body signs account for over 60% of our total communication. So again, as I said before, it's not just the words that we speak, but the way that we kind of enact and kind of perform our words. And body signs, or body language you could also call it, provides the key to speech, providing listeners with the appropriate frame interpreting what a speaker is saying. Another thing is that, the voice, how we sort of express something, affects the convey of meaning. That's always the problem a lot of people have now with the strong sort of focus on online communicating, whether through emails or message boards or Twitters. Sometimes somebody could type something in an email and you don't know the tone, so you don't know if this person is saying something that's, very positive or neutral, or that they're being very threatening. And, again, it's because voice and the way that we sort of articulate and express ourselves is still very important in the meanings that we give behind that language. And another thing to really show in the forefront, and I think a lot of us probably know this already, that changes in culture produce changes in language, and that language is a really great lens to look at cultural change. So now let's get into sociolinguistics. And sociolinguistics investigates the relationships between social and linguistic variation. And it looks at how social categories such as age, gender, ethnicity, religion, occupation, class influence the use and significance of distinctive styles of speech. And it focuses on features that vary systematically with social position and situation, and attempts to also observe, define, and measure variable use of language in real-world situations, and looks at also the social attributes of the speaker. So sociolinguistics is really looking at how language is also very much a reflection of social power, social positioning, and that, there are huge differences between, the way that women and men speak, as well as the power given to some person's way of speaking over other people's way of speaking. So it's really looking at what we're going to be talking later on about the hierarchy of language. There's incredible amount of linguistic diversity within nations. So all nations have pretty much several languages within it. in the United States, millions of Americans learn first languages other than English. English is not the first language for many people living here. And that also what's really interesting in the United States and other places as well is that there are also different dialects. So these are the varying forms of language that reflect particular regions, occupation, ethnicities, as well as social classes that are similar enough to be mutually intelligible. So, in the US, I think we like to talk about the different accents, whether from a New York to a Boston accent to a Southern accent to a Texan accent to a California. I think all of us can give an impression, right? And we kind of know it firsthand. And it also then speaks again to, it reflects not only the particular regions, but also maybe even the meanings and the thoughts behind when we think of people who speak in that dialect. And yeah, it really also, there's a lot more meaning behind dialects than just the different ways of speaking our English. And that also what's really important about linguistic diversity within nations is that social situations influence our speech, as well as geographical, cultural, and social economic differences. And with that, then, there's a hierarchy of language, where it's our tendency to think of certain language or even dialects of a language as better than others. So, take, for example, the dialects in the United States. And think about how, for many people, if they want to become a news anchor in the United States, many of the persons, and it's not so much now, but it was a really big thing until very recently, they had to give up their regional dialect. So whether they were from New York or whether they were from Georgia, and they would have to sort of adopt a mainstream, mostly Midwestern accent. Even though, there's nothing wrong with their dialect, it was seen as not being favorable if you were going to be a broadcaster for the nation. So that's just one example of the hierarchy of language being that certain dialects are seen unfavorably to others. But also, you can talk even about English, versus other sort of languages that are spoken here. One is forefront in a lot of us is Spanish, but there's also big issues in the fact of indigenous languages here as well as other languages in the United States, and that how as much as English is the primary language in the United States, it's also given a lot of social status for people who can speak English fluently versus others who cannot. And there are linguistic differences that result from gender, age, class, region, race, ethnicity, and occupation. There are differences in grammar and vocabulary depending on your gender, age, class, region, race, ethnicity, and as well as body language between different genders, different classes, different ages. And with that, then, with these differences and the sort of hierarchy of what's more seen as better, what's seen as maybe given more status, or seen as more intelligent, all the meanings that we kind of superficially put behind one language or one dialect over another language and a dialect, creates a social stratification. And, our language, especially in the United States, and our speech habits, so our dialect, help determine our access a lot to employment and other material resources. And, for those who cannot speak English fluently or those who have a strong dialect, they may face a lot of discrimination. And there's also a lot of institutional discrimination within the United States. There are programs to learn English as a second language, and there is funding for that, usually by the states. But for indigenous languages here in the United States, there's very little funding for them to sort of fight for their own right to use their indigenous language. So there you have it, where you have a division between what resources are being directed towards. So a lot of resources are being directed towards everyone learning English, which, we can talk about the pros and cons behind that, but that then there's not too many resources being driven towards whether it's indigenous communities here or from immigrant communities here to keep and maintain their own language. The big thing that, and linguistic anthropologists, one of the great things that they do is they really work with fighting and trying to maintain and save languages. And they've been on the forefront of fighting language loss and to also help in the revival of languages. And with language loss and revival, language loss usually is the result of a dominant society assimilating subordinate society. So, for in the US context, English colonialism, and later on then American colonialism, for about 500 years and then, or more, was really adamant about wiping away native groups here in the United States from speaking their language, and that there was this sort of forced assimilation for everyone to learn English, and many languages were tragically lost because of it. They became dead languages, with the speakers not being able, with the children not learning their language from their elders. That language then dies out. Over the last approximately 500 years, 3,500 of the world's 10,000 or so languages have become extinct because of forced assimilation, as well as epidemics and then warfare. And the United Nations Educational, Scientific, and Cultural Organization, UNESCO, is really focused on preserving and reviving traditional languages, because hopefully that we get from this class is that language is not separate from culture or society, and that it forms a really big part of that. So if you're a group, a cultural group, an ethnic group, and you lose the ability to speak your own language, and you don't have that, that's a really huge loss of your cultural identity and your heritage and history. And it can be a devastating loss for many. And I just have an example right there in the corner of an amazing language revival that's happening here in Michigan. And the Ottawa, which are Native Americans located throughout Michigan, have worked very hard with local school boards here in Michigan and universities to provide language courses to their tribal members so that they can keep their native language. And they've worked very hard, the Ottawa community here, to support native language rights and to support generations to come to learn and keep and maintain their own language. Okay, so now let's get into key terms. Language is a system of symbolic communication using sounds and/or gestures that are able to be understood by all members within a society that share the language. Phonology, sound study, is the study of language sounds. Morphology, form studies, the study of patterns of word formation in a language. So that includes verb tenses, pluralization, and compound words. Syntax are the patterns or rules by which words are arranged into phrases and sentences. And grammar, the entire formal structure of a language, including morphology and syntax. And then the last key terms. Ethnolinguistics, the study of the relationship between language and culture and how they mutually influence and inform each other. Linguistic relativity, the idea that distinctions encoded in one language are unique to that language. Focal vocabulary, specialized sets of terms and distinctions that are particularly important to certain groups. And then lastly, dialects, varying forms of a language that reflect particular regions, occupations, or social classes, and that are similar enough to be mutually intelligible. Alright, this is the last class of the semester. Thanks so much for sticking with me. I hope these videos were at the very least entertaining. Alright, take care.